Why did we have to do that, Mr. President? Sa dami na ng... hindi pa tayo makakame up ng total amount of the fiscal space which we have freed up sa programmed appropriations because hindi natin alam yung how much of the 373 billion of new items under unprogrammed appropriations came from program. Hindi pa natin alam eh.
A few moments later.
Patuloy din ang suporta para sa ating mga social protection programs na nagsisilbing lifeline para sa pinaka-vulnerable nating kababayan. Sinigurado natin na matututukan sa susunod na taon ang pagpapatayo ng mas maraming rural health units, DOH at LGU hospitals at bagong urgent care and ambulatory services or bukas centers. We also intensified DOH's capacity to prevent and control communicable diseases, particularly rabies. Through these initiatives, we are sending a clear message. In times of need, the government is here to protect and serve its people. Isa sa pinakamahalagang issue ngayon ay ang seguridad ng ating bansa. Kaya naman dinagdagan natin ang budget ng defense sector. We've increased the funding of the D&D to fund critical projects, including the Kalayaan Island Sheltered Port and the Pag-asa Airport. These are strategic investments that underscore our commitment to asserting our territorial integrity. A more generous funding is also allotted to the Philippine Coast Guard to ensure that our coastlines are patrolled and secured, safeguarding not just our territory, but also the livelihoods of our beloved fisherfolk. We honor our soldiers, the frontliners of our nation's defense, by ensuring that they have the resources they need to fulfill their duties. This includes providing them with the much-needed military subsistence allowances. Ang katarungan at kapayapaan ay importanteng haligi ng demokrasya. To bolster peace and order through programs that ensure safer communities and to increase the capacity of our police force, we have increased the budget of the DILG. Pinondohan din natin ang operasyon ng mga hukuman at ang social lawyering fund upang matiyak ang mabilis at patas na paggamit ng katarungan. We also bolstered the fight against human trafficking and child sexual abuse, as well as cyber crimes, through increased funding for our justice sector. Ang mataas na budget para sa edukasyon ay isang mahalagang puhunan para sa kinabukasan ng ating kabataan. It will fund critical programs such as enhancing teachers, upskilling, and providing learning materials that bridge the gaps in education for every Filipino student. We also increased the budget for the establishment of child development centers to ensure that proper interventions on our children's health at the earliest stage possible are in place. Lastly, the DFA received an increase to strengthen our diplomatic missions and ensure that our country's interests are upheld and our voice is heard in the international community. At this point, allow me to express my profound gratitude for the collective effort that brought us to this pivotal moment. First, to my fellow senators, I thank you for your wisdom, dedication, and steadfast commitment to shaping a budget that reflects the aspirations of the Filipino people. Your diligence and vision have ensured that every allocation in this budget stands for progress and inclusivity. To the technical working group, the LBRMO committee secretariats and legislative staff of my office, the brilliance of this budget lies in your tireless work behind the scenes. From drafting provisions to crunching numbers, your patience and meticulousness made all the difference. Panghuli at pinakamahalaga sa bawat Pilipino, kayo ang pinakapuso ng budget na ito. Hindi man perpekto, ginawa natin ang ating mga kaya sa ating makakayanan. Ang tagumpay na ito ay tagumpay ninyo. Ang budget na ito ay sumasailalim sa inyong boses at pag-asa para sa mas maayos na buhay. I stand before you today with pride and conviction, declaring that we have done our best to fulfill our promise to pass a budget that places you, the Filipino people, at its heart. And as we close this chapter, I can say that it has been my honor to serve and fight for you to build a stronger and more robust nation. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Senator Grace po. Our minority leader is recognized.
Sige. Saan na-start mo? Saan na-start? Mr. President,
Yes, minority leader, Senator Pimentel is recognized.
I think it is our duty, being the minority, to ask some questions, especially about the BICAM report on the national budget, especially after having noticed some significant swings. When we say swing, let's say net changes in some of the budgetary items, Mr. President, reported to us. No? Kasi we are, right before me is a summary of the conference committee report, Mr. President. So with the permission of our chairperson, our chairwoman, if this representation can proceed with these questions, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, I'll gladly take this opportunity.
Mr. President, I'll start with one of the issues that I raised in last year's budget process, or meaning to say, covering the 2024 budget, which is the issue on the level of the unprogrammed appropriations, Mr. President. If I can start with that, Mr. President, if our chairwoman can inform us, all of us, what is now the level of the unprogrammed appropriations under our bicameral conference committee report?
The unprogrammed appropriations is 531,665
million, yes. So that's now the ending of our BICAM report. But then, our NEP, okay, if our chairwoman can find out what was the NEP level of the unprogrammed appropriations, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the NEP level is 158.665 billion.
Yes, Mr. President. So, paki-minus nga. 531.
So it's an increase
Yes,
of 373.
It's here. Yes, an increase of 373 billion pesos. Unfortunately, Mr. President, this practice of increasing the unprogrammed appropriations in the final version of the national budget over and above the level of the unprogrammed appropriations recommended by the President in the President's budget, or called the NEP, is one of the issues I have raised before the Supreme Court. And we are repeating the said practice in our plan for the 2025 budget. Mas maliit nga kasi for 2024 halos if I'm not mistaken 400 billion yung in-increase ngayon, pero it's still ito 373 billion pesos. So was increase. We're increasing it. So was this issue ever touched in the discussion of our chairwoman with the chair of the House panel, Mr. President?
Mr. President, this was actually discussed with our technical working group. What we have decided is that we have limited resources, but there are so many programs that we would like to fund. And unfortunately, we don't have the immediate amount on hand. So there's still certain projects that will be categorized in the unfunded, unprogrammed appropriations. Ideally, there should be none, and I would concede that. That's why from last year, from this year, 2024, which was 737 billion, now we are at 531 billion. There are obviously a long ways to go when it comes to having more fiscal discipline. But this is the reality, and I'm transparent about this, that we really have unprogrammed appropriations. Last year, if I may mention, what was released for this year is, as of November, from the 737 billion, Mr. President, out of the 731 billion, 438 billion of the unprogrammed funds for 2024 was released. So certain priority projects also that were put in the unprogrammed have been funded already.
So meaning to say, since we have data already for year 2024, for year 2024, the administration has released under the unprogrammed appropriations an amount larger than the original figure in the NEP under unprogrammed appropriations for the year 2024. Tama
No,
po?
Mr. President, for 2024, it's 731 billion.
Correct. Yan po yung sa GAA na natin.
For
But
the NEP.
For the NEP, that must have been around 300 billion. Tama po ba?
Yes, Mr. President,
Yes,
281 billion.
281 billion. But now, from actual figures, they have released around 400 billion of the 700 billion in the unprogrammed.
Yes,
Tama.
Mr.
Sige
President.
po. I'm just establishing po that fact, Mr. President. But then, Mr. President, unfortunately, this representation has to be consistent with his stand, Mr. President, and his beliefs, Mr. President. So, that means that we have another issue, Mr. President, which can possibly reach the Supreme Court. Because the Constitution talks about appropriations, that the Congress may not increase the appropriations as recommended by the President. So, very simple lang naman yung interpretation ko po. When the word appropriations is used, it does not distinguish between programmed and unprogrammed appropriations.
Well, Mr. President, the unprogrammed is really not part of the total of the BICAM report or the budget proposed. Okay, so it's obviously, that's why it's called unprogrammed, it's unfunded. Now, if you mention about the President has the power to appropriate for the unprogrammed funds based on certain criteria. First of all, it has to come from a source. For example, extra collections from the government, from GOCCs, dividends, extra collections from the BIR, etc., or even loan proceeds, which, as I understand now, even our Secretary of Finance is not really very keen on adding more additional loans because we have to keep our debt to GDP ratio at around 60 to 61%. So this will really come from extra funding that the government is able to collect.
And for the year 2024, there was an extra or an additional mechanism inserted in funding and unprogrammed appropriations. Yun yung sweeping of the so-called idle funds which affected PhilHealth. Sinasabi ko lang yan so that I will also not forget to raise PhilHealth later on. Pero, okay. But Mr. President, yung 400 billion of the items under unprogrammed appropriations na na-release na at na-fund na for so far for the year 2024, what was the legal basis for funding them? Isn't it dagaa, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President, that was
correct.
actually one of the provisions in the GAA that funding from other sources, government revenue in excess, can fund unprogrammed appropriations.
Correct. So, meaning to say, kahit si unprogrammed is not said, unprogrammed talaga siya. So, hindi siya talaga kasama sa total ni programmed appropriations. But the legal basis, kasi ang general rule sa Constitution natin, no public funds shall be spent except pursuant to an appropriations provided by law. So when those 400 billion items under unprogrammed appropriations were funded, what was the law made as the basis for funding them? Hindi po ba GAA din of 2024?
Yes, Mr.
Correct.
President.
Okay, tama po. Meaning to say, pag sinabing appropriations, kasama si programmed at si unprogrammed. So, Mr. President, with this information, I have no choice but to once again raise this before the Supreme Court, maybe in a new case or siguro, supplemental ba? Or supplemental petition before the Supreme Court, Mr. President.
But, Mr. President, just for clarification, anyway, you're the legal expert here. There's really, all GOCCs remit also to the government, excess funds. And then the GAA, the GAA itself is a law. Now, if these are unprogrammed, I understand that the President also has the power to allocate certain funding options for certain programs. Now, when our minority leader raised this issue with the Supreme Court, I know it was very specific for the PhilHealth funds, which was actually savings that is not really an income-generating matter that has to be automatically appropriated to the government, unlike other agencies that any dividends should be transferred to the government. I know that PhilHealth isn't. So with the clarity given by the Supreme Court, we have that guidance already in mind. That's why we did not specifically put a provision exactly like what we had in 2024.
So our chairwoman is informing us that that fourth trigger or fourth mechanism found in the 2024 GAA as about sweeping idle funds is no longer found in our 2025.
Yes, Mr. President.
Bill. But then, Mr. President, yung petition ko po sa Supreme Court is different. Actually, separate yun. I have actually 4 cases before the Supreme Court, Mr. President. One is questioning the level of the unprogrammed appropriations. Number 2 is the PhilHealth, the order to sweep 89.9 billion pesos of PhilHealth funds. The third would be the Maharlika Corporation. And the fourth would be our intra-party dispute with the party of Senator Robin Padilla, Mr. President. So these are the 4 cases pending before the Supreme Court, Mr. President. So anyway, at any rate, okay, Mr. President, does this mean, since we increased the unprogrammed appropriations level by 373 billion pesos, does this mean that we transferred from programmed appropriations under the President's budget 373 billion pesos worth of line items, and we transferred this to the unprogrammed appropriations part? Is that a correct statement?
Well, Mr. President, yes, partly
Yes,
some
correct.
of them were transferred. But remember, this is also based on a consultation of what the priorities are Of course, we always have a wish list of projects and also initiatives, but in the end, we also look at the disbursement rate, the utilization rate.
Meaning to say, yung 373 billion pesos na increase sa unprogrammed appropriations, lahat ng idea doon, lahat ng items na yon, yung PAPs ang tawag yan lahat ng programs, activities, and projects na yon, were originally found in the President's budget but under programmed appropriations. Is that a correct statement?
Mr. President, some of them
Some?
were not in the original NEP or the President's proposals. Some of them were actually amendments done by, institutional amendments done by either houses.
Okay, by Congress. So, does the chairwoman have the, anong tawag mo doon? Breakdown, which, okay, how much of the 373 billion pesos now found in unprogrammed originally came from programmed appropriations under the NEP?
Mr. President, may we be able to submit that to Your Honor with regards to the specific, because it's quite lengthy to go back to all of them.
Just the total, not the total lang, because bakit ko to tinatanong? Because that means that is now the fiscal space made available under programmed appropriations. That's my point, Mr. President. Kaya ang next tanong, of this fiscal space, paano napuno yun? Saan din galing yung mga new PAPs na pinampuno doon sa amount na yun? Doon patungo yung pagtatanong ko po, Mr. President.
As an example, Mr. President, the foreign assisted projects in the NEP of 2025 is 215,649. Now, what the BICAM approved is 66,279. So basically, 149,370 is now in the unprogrammed.
Yes, binaba. Okay, so let's say 149. But definitely more than that amount siguro, no? You're just using that as an example.
Yes, yes. There are also others.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the level for programmed appropriations did not change. Tama po ba yun? From the NEP level, programmed appropriations is still now, the BICAM report level for programmed appropriations is the same as the NEP level. Tama?
Yes, Mr.
Correct.
President.
Meaning to say, kung nagbaba tayo ng 149 billion, inalis natin sa President's programmed appropriations, binaba natin, pero the level is now the same. Therefore, in the budgeting process by Congress came up with at least 149 billion new items which they funded under programmed appropriations. Tama po yun?
Yes, Mr.
Correct,
President.
correct. That's why we need to know the level, Mr. President. But anyway, the chairwoman has promised to give us in writing na lang, no? The level. So that is what happened. And then, Mr. President, if I can ask about the miscellaneous personnel benefits fund, sa NEP, sa President's budget, 163 billion pesos ang level niyan. Sa BICAM report natin, 109 billion pesos. Meaning to say, nag-free up din tayo ng 54 billion pesos. Kasi hindi rin nagbago yung bottom line. Bottom line, the same. So, is it correct to say that the 54 billion pesos na inalis natin sa MPBF ay nalagyan din ng new items by Congress? Tama po ba yun?
Yes, Mr. President. Also for the miscellaneous and personal benefits, there are a lot of reasons. There are reasons also for that. For example, although there are items in the proposed NEP, the reality is also certain job positions are not filled. That's why we also looked at the utilization rate, disbursement rate as in the past.
Yes, and we were able to free up, let us say, MPBF line lang ito,
54
billion. Kaya
Yes,
nga, and
Mr.
then,
President.
since hindi nagbago si bottom line, ibig sabihin nun, nalagay sa ibang mga budget items yon, PAPs, na hindi na nanggaling sa Presidente, nanggaling na po sa Kongreso. Tama po?
Yes,
Tama
Mr.
po, okay. And then, pagdating sa pension and gratuity fund, sa President's budget, 232 billion ang level nito. Ang ending sa ating BICAM report, 144 billion. So, ano to, mga 88 billion pesos din po yung na-free up natin. Tama po? So, ang gusto sabihin, ang dami na natin na-free up. So,
Mr. President, it's true that compared to the NEP, there may have been a decrease, but bearing in mind also that compared to 2024, there's been an increase. And we know that for a fact that the increase can cover the current needs for personal benefits and pensions.
yes, Mr. President. Pero yun lang, I'm just looking up, I'm just pointing out the fiscal space that Congress has freed up under programmed appropriations. Yun po, that's what I'm pointing out. And bago malimutan, we also freed up 74 billion pesos, 74.4 billion pesos sa PhilHealth subsidy. Tama po yun, which is under programmed appropriations. Tama po?
Yes, Mr. President.
Why did we have to do that, Mr. President? Sa dami na ng... hindi pa tayo makakame up ng total amount of the fiscal space which we have freed up sa programmed appropriations because hindi natin alam yung how much of the 373 billion of new items under unprogrammed appropriations came from program. Hindi pa natin alam eh. But we will add to that the MPBF, we add to that the PGF na mga freed amounts plus the 74 of the PhilHealth. Kinailangan pa ba natin na i-zero talaga si PhilHealth to free up 74 billion pesos, Mr. President?
I know, Mr. President, that's also the question of many. And I've thought about this long and hard. And there's no denying that PhilHealth has a savings amount of 600 billion, Mr. President. And that's also the reason why initially the administration thought of it as a way also to augment certain short fundings that we had, for example, for health workers, etc. Hindi natin maintindihan ba't hindi nila ginagamit yung pera na nandun na meron sila na nakaimbak sa isang, ewan ko kung anong klaseng account yan, savings account, na ang kinikita ay mas mababa pa kesa sa inflation. Mr. President, hindi pwedeng sisihin na nagkulang tayo sa pagbibigay sa kanila. Kasi nga ang dami ngang pera na nandyan. Hindi nila pinamimigay ang pera dun sa mga nangangailangan at tinuturuan din natin sila ng leksyon. Kung bigay ka ng bigay, nandun lang yung pera, hindi naman nagagamit. Paano naman yung mga ibang programa rin ng gobyerno na nangangailangan din ng funding? Yun nga yung sinasabi ko, pag meron kang, syempre, di ba, sinasabi natin, 5 yung anak mo, lahat yan kailangan pantay-pantay na mabigyan mo. Totoo yun. Pero sa lahat sa kanila, tinitignan mo rin kung sino may pangangailangan at sino naman ang may kakayanan na itayo rin ang kanyang sarili. Yun din ang sinasabi natin, it's a leadership problem also in PhilHealth and it's a disbursement problem. Gaya nga ng sinabi ni Senator Cynthia, ang problema din sa PhilHealth, hindi rin natin alam kung ano ba talaga yung mga benepisyo natin. Wala tayong card na nagsasabi hanggang dito o ganyan ang maibibigay sa'yo, ang tagal-tagal ng approval minsan, hindi alam ng ating mga kababayan kung paano sila comply dun sa mga requirements. So ito yung mga nagiging issue. hindi sila kulang sa pera. At alam ko yung iba talagang pinagdidiinan nito. Pero 600 billion ang meron sila. Samantalang, ang dami natin din pangangailangan pagdating sa edukasyon, pagdating sa infrastruktura. Alam mo, maganda talagang magbigay ng social protection, wealth transfer. Importante yan. Pero kailangan din natin ng wealth-generating initiatives kasi hindi natin mapopondohan ang mga ibang bagay na magbibigay ng suporta sa ating mga kababayan kung ang gobyerno ay walang programa na magpapalago ng ating ekonomiya.
I'm reminded of the saying that health is wealth. But I don't think, Mr. President, that we can use funds meant for health so that we will justify this, that we will generate wealth for the nation.
Mr. President,
so,
the budget of the DOH has increased from last year.
DOH.
So it may not have been an item, for example, in particular for PhilHealth. Pero, meron naman pong increase na nangyari dito sa DOH from 241,602 in 2024, yung BICAM natin nasa 247,923. So we are, of course, health is wealth. That's very important. But also, health, the financial situation of our country, the economy, and wealth-generating initiatives are important so that we can support social protection initiatives such as the health sector.
Sige, mag-digress po tayo muna sa health sector. Pero napansin ko po na ang ating final amount sa Department of Health is 247.9 billion pesos sa BICAM report, mas mababa by 25.7 billion pesos from the GAB, 273.7 billion pesos. So, binawasan pa rin natin ang DOH. And then, ang ating pampalubag-loob lang ay yung level, nung binawasan na, yung ending amount is still higher than the 2024 GAE amount?
Yes, Mr. President.
But why did we reduce it, Mr. President, by 25.7 billion pesos, which is a very significant amount also, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, there are certain agencies that we also supported. Like, for example, the Department of Agrarian Reform. We had given them an increase for their budget. We also had given the state universities and colleges an increase in their budget. The DICT, we've also given them an increase. The Department of National Defense also has an increase. So, Mr. President, if possible, we would like to increase all, but then also because of the substantial budget allocation of other departments, we also made sure that departments that are also crucial have a respectable amount that they can operate with.
So, pwede ba nating masabi na itong 74.4 billion pesos ng PhilHealth na ziniro natin ay binigay sa ibang mga ahensya ng gobyerno na sa tingin natin ng ating committee na mas nangangailangan o mas deserving ng amount, at masasabi ba natin na hindi directly health-related yung napuntahan ng 74.4 billion pesos na yon, Mr. President?
Mr. President, hindi sa masasabi nating more deserving, more in need, perhaps.
Yes.
And then also, yes, I think I know where you're question, your next question will lead to. But yes, I think transparently you can look that if you look at the increase in some appropriations, they're not health related.
Yes, they're not health related. Ngayon, Mr. President, ang problema kasi yung timing din ng pagbaba natin eh. We want to teach them a lesson, pero 74.4 billion pesos tatanggalin natin, isi-zero natin. Pero hindi ba natin alam na pinasa natin dito sa chamber natin yung panukala na pababain ng premium rates. Nababa natin eh. At the same time, inutusan natin sila to increase their compensation packages, which ginawa nila. Tapos hindi lang dagdagan pa, may konsulta, etc. So, ang nangyayari po, Mr. President, we are being conservative with PhilHealth by reducing the subsidy by 74.4 billion pesos at a time when when PhilHealth has now committed to be more proactive, aggressive, and then we are returning some benefits to the direct contributors by lowering the contribution rate, Mr. President. Ganyan ang nangyari. So, parang hindi makatuwiran yung makatuwiran yung 74.4 billion pesos reduction, wrong timing pa. Now that kung ano yung itinuturo natin sa PhilHealth, pinapressure natin sila, gagawin na nila, tapos ngayon parang pipilayan natin sila para magawa nila yung sinasabi natin gawin nila, Mr. President.
Mr. President, unang-una, hindi ako naniniwala na mapipilayan sila. Kasi nga may pagkukunan pa rin silang 600 bilyon. So sabihin na natin, 70 billion ang hindi na nalaan sa kanila ngayon sa budget. Meron naman silang pagkukunan na 600 bilyon. Ngayon, sa susunod na taon, kung talagang tinupad nila ang kanilang pangako na number 1, mas iigihan nila ang pagbigay ng suporta sa mga may sakit na nangangailangan. Pangalawa, na-implement na yung batas. Ewan ko kung napasa na ba yung batas na yon na bababaan yung premium at hindi na dapat kasama sa batas yung pag-increase ng premium na yon. At saka natin masasabi na, sige, sa susunod na taon, 2026 budget, pwede na nating punuan muli sapagkat nagagamit na nila yung kanilang reserba.
Nakalimutan ko nga i-mention na pinush ko nga sila na magkaroon ng dental services at ngayon nababasa natin that they are also offering dental services, Mr. President.
Exactly, Mr.
to be
President.
covered.
I think this can be evaluated. For example, you have a child who has committed something, you're teaching your child a lesson, hindi naman porket na nag-reform na kaagad, ay ibibigay mo na muli. Kailangan mo nang patunayan rin na masusustain ito, magagawa niya talaga ng tuloy-tuloy. Kaya nga, dito, uulitin ko at alam ko marami rin ng magtataka dito, no? Pero 600 billion, may pera kang ganon. May mga ibang programa ng gobyerno na pwede ring pondohan at hindi naman maghihirap ang PhilHealth dahil meron silang pagkukunan para bayaran. Ang problema nga nila noon, hindi nila ginagawa yon. Kaya ngayon, salamat sa inisyatibo nga, sinabi nga natin, yung ating minority leader, sinabi, dapat meron kayong dental benefits o gagawin daw nila o ginagawa na nila. O ngayon, may batas pero hindi ko alam, parang hindi pa yata napapasa na hindi muna itataas ang premium, 'di ba? Hindi pa yan batas. 'Di ba? Iamyanda pa lang natin 'yan. Hindi pa yan nangyayari. So sa ngayon, ang daming nagrereklamo na ang taas ng premium ng PhilHealth tumataas, pero ang benepisyo nila hindi pa rin ganyan. Kaya meron pa rin silang nakokolektang premium na mas mataas.
Ang ating problema sa PhilHealth subsidy kasi, Mr. President, is yung formula is provided by law. Yan po, that is the long and short of it. Ngayon, by giving zero subsidy, are we in effect saying that we are suspending that the provisions in the Universal Healthcare Act and the syntax law, so thank you for correcting me, in the syntax law, which provides for that formula, which we discussed during we discussed, I think, during the budget deliberations. We mentioned the formula. So is that what we're doing? Number one, kasi when you give a government agency zero budget, talagang number one ang message dun punishment mo yan. Okay. And then but number two, merong rito na there is a formula, and the formula yields I think around 74.4 billion pesos ang paggamitin yung formula. Hindi pala 73, I will correct myself. 53.13 billion pesos ang may-yield ng formula, Mr. President, around that amount. So, is it also our message that we are suspending the formula found under the sin tax law?
Mr. President, we are not suspending the implementation of a law. What we are saying is that at the moment, it is an unfunded program or law of the government. You know, we have more than 1 trillion pesos of unfunded laws in the country. Maraming mga batas pero nagkukulang ang pondo para dito. Ngayon, the GAA in itself is also a law. I understand the Senate minority leaders mentioned, but this is earmarked. Earmarked ito, so dapat doon talaga napupunta. Pero yung BIR, for example, has also that earmark na they are able to harness or benefit from 1% of their total collections. But because they haven't really reached a certain utilization, the government has not given them that 1% supposedly that would go to them. So, Mr. President, this is not, sadly, the reality is this is not uncommon. And the GAA itself is a law. We have a discretion also to look at the macro picture of a particular time in our society and economy and to see what fiscal space we have.